final crates on the double. Clear the tracks. We're moving out. Prisoner 724. Schmidt. Report.
Present, sir.
Confirmed. Next.
January 17th, 1940, winter seals the American interior under a hard, pale lid. The air is so cold it sharpens every sound, as if the landscape itself has become a drum skin pulled tight. Snow pressed into old pine and frozen earth carries a clean metallic scent somewhere beyond the dark ribs of a forest. A train line hums faintly, not as a roar, but as a long vibration that belongs to distance. On mornings like this, sound travels farther than it should. A door shuts and it arrives like a crisp report. A dog barks and the bark seems to hang in the air, suspended, and a whistle, one thin, human-made note can cut across the quiet and feel like it owns the whole horizon. In that pre-war cold, no one in Wisconsin, Iowa, or the Dakotas is thinking about field hospitals in Normandy, or about German nurses watching Americans work, or about wounded enemies being treated first by hands that were supposed to hate them. The United States is still an ocean away from the worst of the world's fire, but history is already bending toward a place it cannot avoid, and the small sounds boots on boards, wire and wind, and a whistle cutting through fog will someday become the soundtrack of an idea colliding with reality. 5 years later, the war has broken across continents, and that same American interior has become part of the machine that sustains victory. Rail yards, depots, training posts, hospitals, and camps that hold the defeated. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind until you picture it as human weight, roughly 425,000 German prisoners of war held in about 700 camps across 46 states. Source numbers like that are not abstract when you imagine the nightly roll calls, the boots on gravel, the thousand small administrative gestures that keep a cage from becoming chaos. The camps were not built only to contain bodies. They were meant to prove something quietly, relentlessly, that a democracy could hold enemies and still claim it was not becoming what it fought. Source. But long before those prisoners stood behind wire on American soil, another system had to function with even less margin for failure. The medical chain of the U.S. Armies that stretch from the front lines of Europe to the rear, from shattered villages to tent wards, from muddy roads to station hospitals. It is easy from a distance to tell the Second World War as a story of battles and generals. Harder is the story that lives under canvas and dim bulbs, where war is not a map but a body, not a front but a wound. The war's moral tests often happened there, in places where blood made all national myths look thin. That is why this story matters. Not because it is sentimental, not because it asks anyone to believe that war is kind, but because it exposes a rare kind of shock, the shock of rules being honored when they could have been ignored, the shock of an enemy being treated as a patient when the temptation was to treat him as a punishment. It asks what happens when propaganda has prepared you for cruelty and you meet procedure instead. The principle existed in ink before it existed in action. The Geneva framework governing the wounded and sick did not leave much room for interpretation. Officers and soldiers who are wounded or sick, it states, shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. They shall be humanely treated and cared for without distinction of nationality by the belligerent in whose power they are. Source. That sentence is clean on paper. In war, it becomes messy because it must pass through fear, anger, scarcity, and grief before it reaches a human hand. It is easy to speak of humanity in a conference room. It is harder when the man on the stretcher wore the uniform that killed your friends. Yet the U.S. Army built its public promise and in many places its real practice on the insistence that rules mattered. That insistence was not pure altruism, it was also calculation, reciprocity for Americans captured overseas, and a belief that national identity was itself a weapon. But even when motive is mixed, an action can still be real, and when the action is the saving of an enemy's life, the witness to that action can be changed by it, even if she refuses to admit it. The title of this story, German Nurses Were Shaken When Americans Treated Wounded Enemies First, does not mean that every American medic always treated enemy casualties before American ones as a moral performance. Battlefield triage is not theater. It is sorting under pressure, guided by urgency, survivability, resources, and the tactical situation. In some moments, friendly wounded were treated first because they arrived first, or because the line was breaking, or because evacuation priorities demanded it. But the historical truth and the reason for the title's emotional force is that there were moments when Americans treated enemy wounded urgently, sometimes before less critical American cases, because medical need overrode nationality. And for German nurses trained inside an authoritarian world that taught them to expect vengeance, the sight of that rule being lived could feel like the ground shifting under their feet. To understand the shaking, you must understand the expectations those nurses carried. In Nazi Germany, nursing existed inside a society that framed the world as hierarchy. Propaganda taught that enemies were decadent, subhuman, or murderous in their intentions. The American was painted as soft in spirit and brutal when threatened. A people whose civilization would collapse into cruelty. For a German nurse attached to the Wehrmacht medical system, the war's later years were also defined by scarcity. Hospitals short of supplies, wards crowded beyond capacity, the front constantly collapsing, the steady drumbeat of loss. Scarcity shapes how people imagine the enemy. When you have too little for your own wounded, you assume the enemy will deny you everything. And then when German nurses encountered American medical power, whether in a captured field hospital, an evacuation facility, a station hospital, or a POW ward, they often faced something they had not prepared for: abundance translated into procedure, not luxury, not comfort, but a system that could keep functioning at scale. Equipment, drugs, sterile packs, blood, blankets, hot liquids, and most of all, organization. That organization had a sound, the whistle, not a trumpet, not a siren meant to terrify. A whistle small, sharp, practical, used to signal movement, clear lanes, summon orderlies, begin a shift change, or direct the next ambulance. In the war's medical world, the whistle was not romance. It was rhythm. And rhythm was the difference between life and death when the wounded came in waves. The whistle becomes the single, recurring symbol in the story because it captures something larger than any single act of kindness. It is the sound of a system that can afford to obey rules. Scarcity makes brutality feel inevitable. Organization makes restraint possible. The whistle is the voice of organization. The war created places where German nurses could witness this up close. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps History compilation notes that in June 1944, a unit of 63 nurses went to the 168th Station Hospital in England specifically to care for German prisoners of war. Source: that single line is not sensational. It is administrative, but inside it is a world. American nurses assigned to care for enemy prisoners as a matter of duty because the wounded enemy, once in American hands, became a responsibility. It means German patients on British soil in wards staffed by women who wore U.S. uniforms. It means German wounded men hearing English spoken over them, feeling American hands adjust blankets, watching American nurses move through routines that did not pause to ask who deserved care. The moment is easy to imagine incorrectly as tenderness, as a softening. But the truth that makes it powerful is that it was often not soft at all. It was disciplined. It was the hard mercy of procedure. In the ward, care was not offered as sentiment. It was performed as an obligation. A bandage was changed because infection was the enemy now. A fever was treated because fever did not belong to ideology. A stretcher was lifted because gravity was not a political question. The Americans themselves carried an expectation too. American medics were trained to do their work under fire and exhaustion. Their oath, formal or informal, was to keep men alive. Many had seen friends torn apart. Many carried anger, yet the system they served insisted that once the enemy was wounded and under control, he was part of the medical problem, not the moral one, and the moment that could shake a German nurse was precisely that. To watch an American medic bend over a German casualty with the same urgency he would show to anybody that was slipping away. The war's evidence for enemy wounded treatment exists not only in written records, but in visual archives. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum collection descriptions, for example, include references to films showing medical personnel treating wounded German POWs and ruins in post-war Germany connected with U.S. medical units. Source: the existence of such footage anchors the scenario in reality. It means the camera found it worth filming, not because it was rare in a moral sense, but because it was part of the war's human landscape, enemies being handled, treated, managed, and kept alive amid devastation. Yet the heart of the story, German nurses being shaken, requires you to focus not only on what happened, but on what it contradicted, because Nazi propaganda had prepared them for a specific kind of American, a victor who would humiliate the defeated and deny them dignity. When dignity appeared instead, or even when a cold procedural fairness appeared, it created a crack in the mental wall. And when you have lived behind a wall of propaganda, a crack is terrifying because it threatens the entire structure. The crack widened for another reason. The people doing this work in the U.S. system were often women. Nurses were women overwhelmingly. But American military nursing also existed inside a broader mobilization of women in uniform. Over 350,000 American women joined the armed forces across branches in World War II. Source: those numbers matter because they transformed what authority and competence looked like in wartime. Women ran wards, managed supplies, supervised orderlies, enforced sanitation, administered morphine, and kept records that turned suffering into data the Army could act upon. When German nurses encountered American female military personnel, they were not seeing a symbol. They were seeing a workforce that a democracy had mobilized at scale, and that scale was another form of abundance. But the war also carried America's own contradictions into those wards. One of the starkest examples is the experience of black nurses. An essay about black nurses in World War II describes how some were tasked with caring for German POWs, men representing Hitler's racist regime, while those nurses themselves faced segregation and discrimination within the U.S. military structure. Source: that fact complicates any easy moral story. It shows that the same nation capable of humane treatment toward enemy prisoners could still fail to treat its own service members with equal dignity. The nurses in those wards lived inside that contradiction. Their care could be professional, disciplined, and humane, even as their own institution limited their rights. And yet the very existence of that duty caring for enemy prisoners still reinforced a principle that would have shocked many observers in the Axis world: that medicine could be made to stand above vengeance, not perfectly, not universally, but often enough to leave impressions that did not fade. In Germany's collapsing endgame, medical scenes were everywhere. Makeshift hospitals and school buildings, bunkers converted into wards, trains filled with wounded, field stations overwhelmed. The American advance brought its own medical infrastructure into that chaos. Evacuation hospitals, clearing stations. Station hospitals, each part of an evacuation chain designed to move the wounded from the front toward higher levels of care. The American system did not invent triage, but it tried to standardize it. The goal was brutal in its practicality: return the greatest number to duty, keep the force moving. Yet within that practicality, the wounded enemy could still be treated because the enemy wounded, once captured, no longer had tactical value as an enemy. He had value as a human problem that could be managed within the rules of war. German nurses, especially those trained under a regime that demanded loyalty and taught contempt for enemies, could find themselves caught between professional instinct and ideological expectation. Nursing, at its core, is an act of attention. Attention is dangerous to ideology because it forces you to see details. Propaganda lives on generalities. It needs the enemy to be faceless. Nursing is the opposite. It is the measurement of pulse. The observation of color, the careful cleaning of a wound, the counting of breaths. The more carefully you look at a person, the harder it becomes to keep him as a myth. So when German nurses witnessed American care, their shaking was not only moral, it was professional. It was the shock of recognizing a medical system that still functioned, that still had supplies, that still had the capacity to prioritize by need. It was the shock of seeing enemies treat medicine, not as another weapon. It was the shock of hearing the whistle and realizing that the sound did not announce punishment, it announced order. The whistle appears again at the ambulance bay, calling for the next litter team. In the corridor, cutting through the murmur of pain. At the entrance, signaling a shift change so exhausted hands could be replaced by fresh ones. The whistle's note is not emotional, but it creates space where emotion can be contained. Without procedure, emotion floods everything. With procedure, emotion can be carried without drowning the work. And then there is the moment that gives the title its sharpest edge. The wounded enemy treated first. You must imagine it as it really would have happened in a crowded ward. A line of stretchers arrives. Some men are stable, some are fading. One American soldier has a minor wound, a bandaged arm. A clean bullet grazed, pain but no shock. Another casualty, German, is in bad shape, heavy bleeding, shallow breathing, shock setting in. The medical staff does not consult ideology, they consult urgency. The German is taken first because he will die first. The American waits because he can. The American may resent it, the German may not understand it. And the German nurse, watching, trained to expect the enemy to choose vengeance, feels her certainty wobble. This is not a story of Americans loving the enemy. It is a story of Americans obeying a medical logic that aligned with international legal principle, care without distinction of nationality. Source. When that principle is lived, it becomes something else, a demonstration that rules can still exist in the middle of horror. That demonstration mattered because the war was not only about territory, it was about the moral architecture of the post-war world, how prisoners were treated, how wounded enemies were handled. These were not side issues. They were part of what would define legitimacy when the shooting stopped. The broader American POW system is evidence that the U.S. often aimed to keep captivity within a framework of regulated treatment. German POWs in the United States were held under a system shaped by Geneva rules, administrative oversight, and reciprocity, and even though complaints existed, many prisoners recognized they were treated better in the United States than elsewhere. Source. That logic rules, oversight, a desire to avoid becoming what you fought did not begin and end at barbed wire. It extended into medical wards, where the enemy, stripped of weapons, became simply wounded. But the transformation this story seeks is not an institutional transformation. It is an internal one. What changes inside the German nurse? At first, disbelief. Disbelief is a defense mechanism. If you have survived under propaganda, disbelief protects your identity. You tell yourself, it is staged, it is a performance, it is a trick to make us soft. But then you hear the whistle again the next day, and the next, and the procedure repeats. Bandages are changed. Soup is delivered. Records are kept. Fever is treated. No one is required to confess politically in exchange for a blanket. The American nurse does not need to humiliate the enemy to feel powerful. She is powerful because the system behind her is functioning. That is a different kind of power, and it is hard for an authoritarian worldview to process. Then comes discomfort. Discomfort is the moment when the mind realizes it cannot easily dismiss what it sees. Discomfort is the beginning of doubt. Doubt is dangerous. Doubt makes people less controllable. Doubt makes propaganda fragile. Then, perhaps, comes a grudging respect, not for America as an idea, but for competence. Respect is not surrender. It is recognition, and recognition is the seed of transformation. If the enemy is competent and disciplined and capable of restraint, then your own worldview's simple categories are wrong. Finally comes confusion, deeper than respect. Confusion about the war itself. If America is decadent, why is its system so organized? If democracy is chaos, why does it keep functioning under strain? If women's authority is decline, why are American women calmly running wards, supervising men, making decisions that keep bodies alive? Confusion spreads. The nurse cannot return to her old certainty without forcing herself to lie to herself. That is how ideology starts to collapse. Not in speeches, not in trials, but in the accumulation of unignored realities. The whistle becomes the sound of that collapse, not because the whistle is magical, but because it represents procedure, the enemy of propaganda. Propaganda needs extremes, heroes and monsters. Procedure is gray. Procedure is boring. Procedure is relentless. Procedure turns ideology into paperwork, and paperwork is hard to romanticize. A democracy often reveals itself most truthfully in procedure, and how it processes bodies, how it records deaths, how it assigns nurses to care for enemy prisoners because the rules demand it. The whistle calls procedure into motion. It says, the next thing must be done. It does not ask who deserves it. There is also a quiet truth beneath this. Mercy in war often depends on logistics. The ability to treat wounded enemies depends on having supplies. It depends on not being in total collapse. A starving hospital cannot easily afford mercy. A collapsing state cannot easily afford consistency. In Germany's vital months, collapse made brutality easier and mercy harder. In the American system, abundance, industrial, organizational made restraint more possible. The whistle, again, is the sound of abundance translated into order. But abundance does not erase grief. American nurses and medics were not untouched by hatred. Many had personal reasons to hate what Germany represented. Some had seen concentration camps. Some had treated American boys who died. The war did not ask them to become saints. It asked them to do their jobs, and sometimes their jobs required treating the enemy. In those moments, the American nurse became a kind of living contradiction. A person with every reason to feel anger, still choosing procedure, not necessarily because she loved the enemy, but because her training, her duty, and her system demanded it. That is what could shake a German nurse the most, to see a person refuse to become what the war was trying to make everyone become. War tries to reduce humans to categories. The wounded body resists reduction. The nurse who treats the enemy is forced to see the enemy as a body first. The German nurse watching is forced to see Americans as humans first. That is the transformation. Categories dissolve, and when categories dissolve, ideology weakens. And somewhere behind all of it is the law. The 1929 language about care without distinction of nationality is not poetry. It is a demand. Source: later Geneva language reinforces the principle of humane care without any adverse distinction. Source: these are not sentimental ideas. They are attempts to build a floor beneath human behavior in war to prevent total collapse into vengeance. The question this story raises is whether that floor holds. The answer historically is imperfect. It holds in some places and fails in others, but it held enough in enough American wards that witnesses remembered it and that archives contain the traces of it in unit histories, in nurse corps records, in film scenes of enemy prisoners being treated. Source: the title asks us to imagine German nurses being shaken. Not shaken because they were humiliated, but because they were confronted with a different kind of power. Power that could treat enemies as patients and still win. That is what authoritarian ideology fears most. It can explain cruelty. It struggles to explain discipline, restraint. And so we move toward the end of the war, toward the aftermath when the shooting stops and the wounds remain. Many German nurses return to a country that no longer looked like the one they believed in, cities broken, families displaced, the Reich gone. In that ruined landscape, memories of American wards might return unexpectedly. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of boots on boards, and above all the whistle, small, bright, unmistakable, calling the next task forward. The memory of that whistle would not necessarily create love for America, but it could create something more lasting. An inability to fully believe the old lies again, because the deepest defeat in war is not always the loss of territory. Sometimes it is the loss of certainty. When a German nurse saw Americans treat wounded enemies first, when she saw medical urgency outranks nationality, her certainty cracked. She could still hate. She could still grieve. But she could no longer claim that the enemy was exactly what propaganda said. The epilogue returns to winter because winter is honest. It reduces the world to essentials. Cold does not care about ideology. Blood does not freeze differently for Germans or Americans. Breath looks the same when it turns to fog. And in that winter air, the whistle remains the cleanest symbol of what the story is really about. Not softness, not sentiment, but procedure as a moral act. A whistle is cheap. It requires only breath. It can be carried in any pocket. Yet in war it becomes the sound of organized life. It can summon stretcher bearers. It can clear a corridor. It can keep a ward from collapsing into panic. It can enforce a rhythm that makes mercy possible. The whistle does not speak of freedom with grand words. It speaks of freedom in practice. The freedom of a system to obey its own rules even when hate would be easier. The freedom of a nurse to do her duty without becoming an instrument of vengeance. The freedom of a wounded enemy to discover that the world still contains law, even at its darkest edge. Perhaps that is the larger truth. Ideologies often collapse not only under bombs and tribunals, but under ordinary procedures that refuse to cooperate with hatred. A prisoner can endure suffering and call it proof of the world she already believes in, but when she encounters a contradiction, when she sees wounded enemies treated first, when she hears the whistle summoning care instead of punishment, she faces a rarer kind of defeat, the defeat of certainty. In that defeat, something like freedom begins, not freedom from consequences, not freedom from memory, but freedom from the lie that power must always be cruel, that victory must always humiliate, that enemies must always be denied their humanity to prove yours. And so the whistle sounds again across a snowy landscape and through the thin walls of a tent ward, clear and steady. It does not promise a perfect world. It promises only the next step in a system built to keep life going. Sometimes that is what democracy is at its most unromantic and most real. Not a speech, but a procedure. Not a flag, but a rule obeyed. Not a myth, but a whistle cutting through winter air, calling human beings friend and enemy alike, back to the same fragile truth that a wounded body cannot be argued with,